This is an interview with John Corley, the retired conductor of the MIT Concert Band, interviewed by Forrest Larson in the Lewis Music Library, August 19th, 1999. I'm here with John Corley, the retired conductor of the MIT Concert Band. I'm Forrest Larson. We're in the Lewis Music Library, and it's August 19th, 1999. So John, thank you very, very much for coming. I've been looking forward to this.
I am too.
So much. You have quite a distinguished career and lots of things to talk about. So can you tell me about where you grew up, your early musical training experiences, your teachers, high school bands, orchestras, that kind of thing?
Well, condensed so quickly. Born in Vermont, lived in northern New Hampshire through the second grade, then down to Connecticut near Hartford, and then to Medford. Medford was from grade 3 or 4 on through high school. And my musical experience started in junior high school as a trumpet player. I was really turned on by trumpet, and I trace that back to my excitement on hearing the town band back up in Vermont and New Hampshire when we would go back to visit with relatives during the summer. And so it seemed a natural thing to be attracted to the trumpet. And that happened in junior high school. And I was fortunate in studying with two elderly trumpet players who were prominent in the field. One was Bert Fisher, who was Walton Smith's solo cornetist in the Smith Band in Boston, and a pupil of Herbert L. Clark, and consequently I had to learn all the Herbert L. Clark solos, which were very difficult pieces. On into high school as not only the solo cornetist of the band, but as a student conductor of the band, which turned me on. And I had a performing group. It was a brass sextet, and we played at women's clubs. We played at various affairs throughout the town, and ended up playing in competitions. And I wrote a lot of pieces, not composed, but arranged a lot of pieces for the sextet, hence the beginning of my arranging experience. Then to BU Music School, continuing on trumpet lessons, pursuing a course in music education. My senior year was interrupted by World War II, and I enlisted at the end of the first semester senior year, and played in an Air Force band, solo cornet, and ended up going to the Army Music School in the fall of 1942, and graduating there ahead of my class, and stationed in Texas. My first band was, I played in Texas. My first band was in the 28th Division, Omar Bradley's division. And immediately I was not only conducting band rehearsals and concerts for the troops, but training with fixed bayonet and steel helmet and the whole business, because after all, we were infantry. Our mission was CP security, command post security. And when we weren't doing that, we were entertaining the troops. I had some very good musicians in my band, people from Juilliard, Curtis Institute, Conservatory. So I was privileged to have a very good group to conduct and for which to arrange music for band. I was taken suddenly from the 28th Division to the 29th Infantry Regiment, which was going overseas, and the band leader of that group was elderly, and they wanted a younger band director, and I was the youngest band director because I just made it by one day, qualifying for age, and so I was suddenly transferred, and after going through desert maneuvers and a lot of mountain climbing and all that, to Iceland, completely different, the Army way of doing things. But in Iceland, I ended up not only playing concerts every night except Wednesday for the troops, different concert each night for a whole month, then the cycle would start over again. But it also included Canadian troops, British troops, the American Navy, and one concert a month for the Icelandic civilians, the purpose of which was to break down the anti-American feeling. And my programs were censored to make sure they had proper music that wouldn't be offensive to the Icelanders and would still give a good impression of the American taste in music. For those concerts, I invited refugee musicians who had fled from Nazi Germany to the safety of Iceland, violinists, singers, one pianist, for which I would write arrangements of concertos or excerpts from operas to use those musicians. And that was a very exciting experience. I could go into detail on that, but I think I'll pass that up. But we played everything from Mendelssohn arranged for band, believe it or not, to excerpts from Die Walküre of Wagner for a German Helden tenor who was so exciting. I guess goosebumps just thinking about Peter Janssen. So those were exciting days. But even then, I was writing for that band, and I was inviting people to write for the band, one of whom was the Postmaster General, who was pro-American, and it was through Sigurður Baldwin's son. Sigurður Baldwinson, an older man, was most friendly to me. He kept a language barrier between us, so he could turn me off if necessary. He always spoke Icelandic, and I had with me always an interpreter who was Major Helmerson in the CIA. And he would go with me to all the appointments that I had with Baldwinson. And Baldwinson wrote a piece for us, for the band that is, and dedicated it to the commanding general of the Iceland Basic Command, who was a former governor of Oklahoma. And we played that. Baldwinson was present, the governor, the general, of course, was there, and all his staff. This was like 8 a.m. in the morning. I made a lot of friends, obviously, with the staff on a Sunday morning, 8 a.m. And then we were invited to play down in Borg Square in Reykjavik, the capital city, on a Sunday afternoon. And when we went into the square, this takes time to tell, but it's worth hearing. It was overcast, and it was beginning to sprinkle. And Baldwinson, American Major Baldwinson, arranged that we go into the Borg Hotel, which was on the square, and play in the ballroom. And the crowd followed us in. The program, I had programmed the Danish Festival Overture by Tchaikovsky. I can't whistle a bit of a tune or anything from that. It's not much of a piece, but it included the Danish national anthem as the finale. Well, I didn't know about it at the time, but that was the day that the Nazis made the King of Denmark a house prisoner in Denmark. And Iceland was a part of Denmark in those days. So the feelings were running very much anti-Nazi, where there'd been some doubt. There'd been a lot of anti-American feeling. But anyway, I played not only the Icelandic hymn, which Barvinson had secured for me so I could arrange that for band, which is their national anthem, and the Danish festival. The next day, headlines: American band plays Danish anthem, or whatever the name of the piece was of him. And I was suddenly a hero, a big frog in a very tiny pool. And I was invited right away to the government building and everything, and toasted that night at a dinner. And then the next Friday was my time to go see Mr. Barvinson at his home. And there was no Helmerson. The major wasn't there. I said, and it was sign language. I said, Helmerson? And he said, in perfect English, it won't be necessary. He won't be with us tonight. He spoke English all along and waited until that moment to converse with me in English. And we became very good friends. He used to ask me to sit and listen to Boston Pops records. I'll leave Iceland now, but I was there 29 months.
Wow.
It's conducted some 700 concerts for our own troops and the Allied troops there. And for USO musicians, I have one more story to tell.
Certainly.
The USO sent various troops to Iceland to entertain the troops, one of which was Isaac Stern and his accompanist, and a soprano from the opera, from the Metropolitan.
Was that Samuel Sanders, his accompanist, or was it before him?
That's very familiar, that name. This would have been...
he was his longtime accompanist. I don't know.
I think it was Sanders. And he was accompanying also the soprano, Paulina Staska. And she sang Strauss. Boy, and also O mio bambino caro from Gianni Schicchi, Puccini, and wow, I'll never forget that trio. They got weathered in and couldn't take off to go to England, and so Isaac Stern needed a place to stay, and they stayed in my quarters with me. And for 6 days he was there. We'd have breakfast together, our noon meal, and our dinner together, and then he'd practice all the time, and I'd go do my concerts and rehearsals and so forth. And I was in the middle of a rehearsal one morning, and the weather had cleared, and my orderly came down and says, Mr. C, Isaac Stern is leaving now, but he'd like to see you before he goes. So I canceled the rest of the rehearsal and dashed up to my quarters, and he was all dressed, but he was barefooted. He said, I just washed my socks this morning. I need a pair of socks. I reached in the drawer and gave him a pair of GI socks. And we shook hands and he took off. Years later, when my son, this should have been about 7 or 8 years later, was a small boy, I took him to the Boston Symphony Youth Concert. I was one of the founding directors of that, along with Harry Ellis Dixon. And Isaac Stern was playing with the BSO that weekend, and so Harry Ellis Dixon invited him to make an appearance at the youth concert that Saturday morning. I asked my son, John, would you like to meet Isaac Stern? He said, sure. We went backstage, and as we stood in line at the door where he was signing autographs, he looks up at me and he says, I owe you a pair of socks. would believe that. I owe you.
Wow. Wow. When you were talking earlier about some of your growing up, you mentioned the Vermont Town Band. Tell me a little bit about that. You said that it really inspired you to start playing music.
Well, just the thrill of the sound of it. I can still hear it now in my mind as it comes down the street in Newport, Vermont, in step, playing a Sousa march or something, and the excitement of that sound. And I'm still turned on by marches, by the great old marches. And of course, as an Army band leader, I knew a lot of marches.
You certainly did.
And there are certain marches where all the company buglers, each company had a bugler, and the buglers were all trained by one of my trumpet players. They would augment the band and play those marches that had bugle calls. Bum ba bee, ba ba bee, ba bee, bum, that sort of thing, you know, at the back.
Art to just that. Yeah.
At the back of the band, you know.
Yeah. Were town bands still relatively common then?
Yes.
Because
yes.
these days they're gone.
My father saw Sousa, and you know, bands were still going into the certainly the 30s, and I think there's still a tradition for town bands. I just received a letter within the last couple of weeks from a former musician friend of mine who is now in Sanford, Maine. He says he's playing in the Sanford Town Band.
Oh, good. I know some of the places they keep them up.
In rural areas. It was a very important medium for sharing music with people in those days was the band, because of its projection, the way it could project out of doors, you know, where string instruments would be limited.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you come from a musical family? Was your father a musician?
Dad was not a musician, but he should have been. Mother was a musician. She was a fine pianist, had studied at LaSalle Junior College. Her father-in-law, in other words, her mother's first husband, was the president of LaSalle, and Mother studied with George Dunham and would play all the Beethoven sonatas and that sort of thing, and it was my accompanist. When I became a soloist, she was a very adequate accompanist. Dad, however, had the musical taste and the ear for music. I remember bringing home from school, from the Brookline schools, the Seashore test, which was a hearing test to decide to recognize pitches or the lengths of notes or the intensity, or several areas. And we had a bunch of musicians, we had a family orchestra, and I passed out the answer sheets, and they all took the test, and Dad asked if he could have a copy of it to follow. And and I played the test, and my brother scored very high, and I scored in the upper 80s, I think. I've forgotten what all the various people did. And Dad passed the sheet to me. He had a perfect score. He said, "You see, my ears are uncluttered by training." But it was through Dad that I went to operas. We went to operas together. We went to Boston Symphony together. I wasn't the only one he took to operas and symphony, of course. Just the two brothers, myself and Bob, and Mother, of course. But it was important for me to be taken to operas. And the WPA days, operas were inexpensive.
Any particular ones that stand out as memorable? What's your life?
Now my tastes have changed, but Madame Butterfly was the first opera that we attended, and right away we had the complete recording of it on 78.
How many discs?
I was going to say 8 or 10, you know, and then we went, that grew into La Boheme and into Tosca, and early on Dad took me to the Valkyrie. I heard Arthur Badonsky conduct Valkyrie with Kirsten Flagstad and Lawrence Melchior. Wow, to this day Flagstad is my favorite. So that turned us on, but we ended up seeing Butterfly as a family about 10 times. It became a family off. Now my tastes have changed.
Yeah.
I don't hear it that much, although I have, I think, 3 complete recordings in the house.
Oh, wow.
My tastes have turned to the late Richard Strauss operas.
Did any of your siblings play music?
My number 3 son is very interested in music. He doesn't perform, he doesn't play, but he's become an avid listener. And just this week, we followed the score together of the Rosenkavalier.
Wow.
And he's very, and a week before that, we followed the score of Tristan. I'm so pleased that he asked when can we hear some more music together. It's very important to him. My daughter, by my second marriage, is also very much into music. I'm not a performer, however, but she collects a great deal of music, mostly of the young people's variety. But she loves to go to symphony, and so I feel very grateful of them, their taste.
Now you're like your brothers and stuff. Did they play any music at all?
My brother, I have just the one brother, Bob, and 3 years, 3 months younger, and he became a very fine trombone player. Played in the Indianapolis Symphony, and then left the symphony after only a few seasons, married, and came back and became a music educator, as I was. And Bob was the director of music in the schools in Weston for many years while I was in Brookline.
Wow, wow. Did you have any sisters?
No sisters.
No sister, just a brother. Wow. Growing up, did you ever play any jazz?
I played in a big band,
Uh-huh.
you know, and that was a great experience. And we were we were very busy on the weekends, and you know we were playing arrangements of Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey stuff, that sort of stuff. We had people in the band who could listen to a recording and copy it off and play the same tunes. Tuxedo Junction, 1 O'Clock Jump. Wow. That experience proved very, very helpful when it came to playing at the Schubert Theater. The dance band experience was so helpful in quickly grabbing the style of whatever show I was playing.
So tell me about playing at the Schubert Theater.
Well,
What was the group? And
I was on staff at the Schubert Theater as a trumpet player.
and this would have been about what time?
Well,
What
this
years?
is in the, I'm going to say the early 70s, but I'd done a lot of playing before that, orchestra playing as an extra man in Boston Symphony, as I would be usually the trumpet player or one of the trumpet players that would be hired to play with the Royal Ballet or Sadler's Wells or even the Russian ballets that would come and play. And I also played Metropolitan Opera. I played Aida
Wow.
more than once
Wow.
on stage.
So you had
Otello was
considerable orchestral experience as well.
yeah, played the Meistersinger more than once. Also played in the pit on the Meistersinger. Wonderful opera. But so the gamut ran everything from symphony to opera to ballet to Schubert theater and other shows at other theaters.
Now, was there an established group at the Schubert Theater? Or was there like a resident dance orchestra or something? Or how did that work?
There was a list of musicians that were called upon to fill whatever was needed.
Okay.
Some shows would come in and wouldn't need trumpet players. They had trumpet players with them.
Mm-hmm.
Some shows would come in with only one trumpet player and maybe a couple of woodwinds and maybe a concertmaster, a first violinist, and a drummer usually, and then hire the rest of the people from the Boston local through the Schubert Theater.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a contractor there who would call me up, can you come in and play such and such a show? It starts here, the rehearsal is here, and it runs for 3 weeks or something like that. And I would have to make arrangements to cover my other evening rehearsals or whatever, which leads me to say I was lucky in those early days at MIT, back when I was doing a lot of playing, that I had a woodwind specialist, Phil Vascuriga, and a brass specialist, Willis Traphagen, to assist me with the concert band. And they were available at all the rehearsals and would come in on other times to lead the brass ensemble or the woodwind ensemble.
So tell me about the playing with the BSO. You were a sub in the trumpet section, and
If they needed an extra trumpet, I would get a call, and consequently, I played for Leinsdorf. I played in an all-brass group from the symphony at Sanders Theater, in which we played a Walter Piston piece for brass.
which one was that? Do you remember?
It was a piece for brass and male chorus. And I have a recording of it, but I can't tell you the name of it now. Good piece or strong piece. I like Piston very much.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed you've programmed Piston. I looked at list of things
Yeah.
you performed. And,
Yeah. And when I conducted the orchestra at MIT, we did the complete Incredible Flutist.
Yeah.
We did the ballet, the whole ballet. And Piston came to the rehearsals. And the theater would be dark, Kresge would be dark. And he'd be sitting up there listening to the rehearsals. Jan Veen, who had done the choreography, was still living then. And the dancers were from the Boston Conservatoire. And so it was a natural to bring Jan Veen and Piston together at Kresge, and I'm conducting the orchestra in the pit. And I remember saying to the orchestra that Mr. Piston was here in the audience, and my third trombone player, Mike Lee from Texas, came up and he said, "Is the composer of this piece there?" I said, "He's sitting right there on the end of the aisle." He says, "You think he would write on my program?" I said, "I'm sure he would." And he went and he got his program and crowded by me out of the pit. And I stayed in the pit with my music stand looking at the score and the light. And he went up to meet Mr. Piston, and he was back in a flash. And he said, he did it. And he opened it and he showed me the program underneath my music stand light, and it said, Johannes Brahms. That was Walter Piston, and he was forever doing things.
I was going to ask you a little bit about what was he like?
Piston?
Yeah, sounded like a very funny person.
Well, I'm going to say he was a Yankee. First and foremost, he was a Yankee, you know, and very, very, very friendly, very human, and funny, obviously. And those were his jokes. And there were a lot of Piston stories woman coming up and says, "Oh, I love your magic flute." Of course, she meant the incredible flutist. And he says, I've forgotten what his response was, but it was something in line with Johannes Brahms. You know?
Wow. One thing I'm really interested in, when you were with the concert band and your dedication to new music, and you have a deep love for some of the non-tonal and so-called dissonant music. Where did you first hear more modern music like that, and how did that taste develop for you?
Well, I think it goes back to my Army band days, that we were forever trying new sounds. And I had a progressive group, there again, the Juilliard Conservatory training, and the Icelandic pieces that were written for us were on the modern side. I had played music of Ruggles.
Which Ruggles?
Charles Ruggles.
Yeah.
Angels.
Yes, that's beautiful.
Isn't that Ruggles?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a brass piece. Yeah.
Right. I had played that before I went into the Army. I like Copland very much. Mm-hmm. I arranged for my Army band in Iceland, El Salón Mexico, which was a favorite of mine, and played it for the Icelanders at the formal concert that we did once a month for the Icelanders. The first time Copland was ever played in Iceland. When the MIT concert band went back to Iceland 6 years ago, we did emblems of Copland to do Copland again in Iceland. One of the first pieces written for the MIT concert band was written by Ernst Levy,
who taught here at MIT.
And he wrote a piece called Suite for Band, simply, but it's a set of variations on the Swiss national anthem. He was from Basel, Switzerland, and he wrote a system of variations on that, and themes derived from that, and that was quite contemporary. Mixed meter, quite difficult, very strong music, and also on staff in those early days at MIT was Gregory Tucker.
Yes.
And Gregory Tucker composed a piece for the band, a prelude and allegro, and was also known as the Centennial Overture, because it came at the time of the MIT Centennial. And we played it then, and played it many, many times. And that's a strong mixed meter piece with a lot of dissonance, some hidden references to if you knew Susie as I knew Susie, that's hidden in there. He had, like Piston, had a sense of humor. I have to pay tribute to Bill Grossman, who was student conductor back in those early days at MIT. The score to the Tucker piece was lost, so I was conducting from a lead sheet with just the melodies, because we didn't have a score. And Bill Grossman, who went on to conduct Cats in New York, Bill Grossman took the parts, and from the parts constructed a full score, then carefully edited it. We did it together, and so now the Prelude and Allegro is available. It's a fine publication, ready to be published for other bands to play.
Yeah, we'll get into some of that later. I wanted to ask you about some of your other earlier pre-MIT experiences. When you were at Boston University, who did you study with there? And you also must have studied conducting, or did you do any conducting there?
Yes, I did. I didn't have any lessons as such with Arthur Fiedler. He was the conductor of the orchestra, but nevertheless we got to know him as well as any student did, and I watched him very intently at his rehearsals, which were my rehearsals too, because I was playing for him, his first trumpet. And Fiedler really turned me on in his strength of his conducting, the strength of his downbeat, if he wanted a strong downbeat. And believe it or not, it was Fiedler who, when I was a freshman, my first concert with Fiedler was the Beethoven 7th Symphony,
Wow.
which was quite an experience for a freshman trumpet player to play you know, that's quite a piece. And thanks to Fiedler, more pieces like that. Later on, I arranged for him to conduct the New England Intercollegiate Band and went to Fiedler's home with the MIT library list, band library list, and we selected a program for him to conduct, all original music, of course, and including the Andy Caston piece. And there again, we had a piece written for the occasion. Composer escapes me right now, he's since deceased. Hugo Norden wrote a fugue, prelude and fugue type piece. I asked Fiedler, how do you like the Norden piece? He says, a fugue is a fugue.
Were there any experiences at Boston University in regards to contemporary or modern music that stand out to you? I'm just really curious because you have such a deep love and a strength in your musicianship with that repertoire. And was there anything at Boston University that helped you in that way?
Well, Carl Geiringer was probably my most famous teacher.
So he taught at BU.
He taught at BU, and Carl Geiringer was my teacher. Was a teacher of mine and my thesis reader. But yet there wasn't that much modern music going on. I think I was probably the agitator to get more modern music going on there. Fiedler did some modern things with the BU Orchestra.
What were some of the things that he did?
He did a piano concerto by René Berton, and I've never seen it. I'm not sure it's in the catalogs anymore. He did some, I was going to say some Poulenc, I think so. He did a lot of Haydn symphonies, of course. The Beethoven 7th. Also the Beethoven number 6. And he did some student compositions. The Liszt E-flat piano concerto, I remember. But there again, it was very limited in number of modern pieces.
So you were kind of a bit like an agitator to kind of get things going.
Yeah. I think I was collecting recordings. I remember early on buying a recording of Stravinsky, Song of the Nightingale, and just being so turned on by that. course, they had the Petrushka and the least water soldat, the Rite of Spring, Firebird, of course, all those things. But I was also interested in ragtime, in Stravinsky ragtime. All the Mio pieces turned me on. I think it was really through recordings that I got turned on to the contemporary literature.
Did you listen to any of the second Viennese school in Schoenberg?
Yes, yes. The second Viennese school is important to me now, very much so. And believe it or not, one of my favorite composers is Korngold. His violin concerto is a beautiful piece.
It's a good piece.
Yeah.
It's starting to get more performances.
Yeah. Really turned on by Korngold and Strauss, of course, the late Strauss. My tastes change, and there are some composers I avoid. And then when I do hear them, usually by accident, they come back as old friends.
Who are some of those?
Schubert, Unfinished Symphony, and Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky, as an orchestral, as an orchestral player, was turned on by Tchaikovsky and the way he wrote for brass, which is very strong. You know, I've played the Fourth Symphony of Tchaikovsky as a trumpeter more than once, and that's a lot of fun. But to listen to it over and over is kind of boring because it's so repetitious. His way of developing something was to do it over and over and over in different keys or different pitches. I don't have a favorite Tchaikovsky, and I avoid him. Now I've done 1, 2, 3, 4. I've conducted 4 of the Tchaikovsky symphonies with orchestra. And that's enough. Brahms comes and goes. I've conducted 3 of the Brahms symphonies more than once, and I must say, I haven't heard them for a long time. Having mentioned that, it's time to hear them again. But rather than talk repertoire, let me go on to your question.
Certainly. Talk just a little bit about your teaching in the Brookline schools.
I was the band director. I was hired as the band director. After the war, I came back to finish my senior year. I came out of the Army in January, February 1946, and immediately signed up for the second semester of the academic year, which would have been my senior year at BU. And right away I was teaching private lessons in trumpet and teaching at Medford instrumental lessons. And then I got hired in I was 46 to teach at Medford High School as the assistant band director. And then immediately Brookline came looking for a band director, and I went to Brookline in 1947. And the band consisted of about 13 or 14 students, and I built the band up right away by giving a lot of lessons after school and getting people interested in instruments. I saw a big student walking down the corridor. I used to see if I could get him to take the tuba, you know. I wanted big tubas, and that worked. And pretty soon I was able to put out on the field about 30, 40 people. And we were playing pretty easy music, but by God, we were playing it with spirit and a lot of energy. very shortly that band had built up to the extent that we did actually a transcription of the Siegfried Rhine Journey, high school band, or Pines of the Appian Way. I had horns, and I had, for the Pines of the Appian Way, I had obviously English horn. And Mike Hillman was the English horn player, and very good. And I arranged for that band. I arranged the Polovetzian dances for the high school band. We did it with chorus, high school band. And we were doing original pieces. We were also doing transcriptions. And we were scoring high marks at audition festivals. And it was really going well. So when the directorship of the department, when the director of music position opened up, I was on a crest. I was on a high with the high school band at that point. And I didn't apply for the position of director of music right away, but when I saw some of the candidates who came in as applicants for that job, that position, I decided I better apply too, because I didn't want to work for any of them. I'd rather work for myself, and I did, and applied, and was selected as the director of music, which would have been, what year was that? 56, I think. Yeah, 1956, thereabouts. I gave up being band director because I couldn't do that, plus be director of music and handle all those responsibilities.
So there was a lot of administrative work.
Oh, yes, because it also involved the Brookline Music School, which was a lesson-giving organization.
Right.
Plus the chamber music concerts. I was a member of that board and bringing chamber music into the school. And the Brookline Youth Concerts, which were bringing ensembles from the Boston Symphony to play for children at Brookline. There was a lot going on that involved the director of music presence and input at meetings and things.
Wow. Now you also taught at the Boston Conservatory of Music, and you were a conductor of the wind ensemble there.
Yes. That's those were good years. And the group was not as large as the MIT concert band, but they were expert musicians because they were all taking lessons, which is something MIT people don't have a chance to do because they're busy enough with their academic. But the Boston Conservative Group gave a wonderful performance of the Hindemith Symphony, the Schoenberg Variations, the Giannini Symphony, and new music compositions for us. So that was a very progressive group. I was engaged by Randall Thompson to score for band his Testament of Freedom.
Really? I wondered about that.
And it was published by E.C. Sherman, and the transcription that I did for band from that, and I worked from the full score, of course. And the reason I happen to remember this, Randall Thompson became a very good friend, and he wanted also a band arrangement of the last words of David, a shorter piece, of course. And so I did that, and at that time I was at Boston Conservatory. And I arranged that the Boston Conservatory Chorus sing the last words of David, um, and Randall Thompson conducted the arrangement that I had done. So there was a Randall Thompson night at Washington Conservatory. It was on his birthday. As a matter of fact, I don't know what birthday it was, but he was already on in years anyway. But it went well, and that was the first performance of that arrangement with the composer conducting, which was a nice experience.
My goodness, my goodness. I'd seen a reference to that in Klaus Liebman's History of Music at MIT had written, and I wondered what that was. So I'm glad.
Well, the Testament of Freedom was for male chorus, and we did it. There had been a band arrangement made. Each movement was done by a different arranger, and Thompson was not happy with it. But Klaus did that with his glee club and the concert band in that edition, and I think that's what inspired, at least moved Thompson to want a new arrangement, a better arrangement, if you will, that was consistent from movement to movement. It's been recorded. I have a recording I have a CD of Randall Thompson, Testament. I can't tell you the group right now, but I'll give that information to you.
I'd be very interested.
Yeah.
I also read that you were guest conductor of the Cambridge Festival Orchestra. Tell me about that group, because I don't think they're around anymore.
No, they're not. But it was a orchestra of professionals, which played under that name. Why it was the Cambridge Festival Orchestra, I think it's because a number of the performances were at Sanders Theatre, probably the extent of it. And but this should have been back at the time of the Boston Arts Festival, which was on the Boston Common. And
And what years would have this been?
there would have been, I'm going to say around 52, 53, 54, maybe 5 and 6, somewhere in that period. I played a number of times the trumpet, but I also conducted a professional band. The union organized a professional band for me to conduct American music for band at the Boston Arts Festival, which was, and we played a lot of stuff that MIT was already playing. You know.
Wow. So the Cambridge Festival Orchestra, what kind of repertoire did you do with them?
That was usually ballet. It was accompanying ballets. I think ballet conducting was my favorite kind of conducting, because you had to really know the score, so you were free to watch the stage all the time.
That's right.
You watched their feet and their knees. You didn't watch their faces, but you were watching the emotion to see if you're with them all the time.
That's very demanding.
And a climax was frequently a lift. It wasn't hitting the floor. It was when they would leap into the air. That was the climax. And when we did the Incredible Flutist at MIT, I opened with a reduced version of the Seasons, of Glasnow's Seasons, which is lovely music. And then we had a manuscript. That composer's name escapes me right now. And he's no longer in the area, but I'll think of that someday.
Yeah.
Jerry Siddons, that's the name. Jerry Siddons wrote a ballet called Rope of Sand, and
from the Civil War, that Civil War speech, or in the pre-Civil War. Is that referring to that? Or was that the congressional speech? I forgot who it was that was talking about the.
Well, this is a love story, as I recall.
Oh, interesting.
A love story that somebody coming along the road and turning on a young unaccompanied farm girl. Anyway, the climax of the thing is when they come together and people. Andy Casson, who was playing percussion in the orchestra, said he didn't know which was more exciting, watching the stage or watching me on that climax.
Oh, wow. What were some of the other groups that you conducted? Like there's an orchestra in Hingham that you conducted?
Yes, it was 26 years in Hingham, which was a community orchestra, and never a very large orchestra, although we combined with the Arlington Orchestra under John Bavicki, and with the combined orchestra did a Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, big forces for that. That was one of the high points. But the Hingham Orchestra was pretty much locked into traditional repertoire, Haydn, Mozart symphonies, Beethoven. We did 2 Brahms symphonies, only 2 of the Brahms, but we did concertos, and we did ballet performances with a local dance group. That was a growing experience always for the members of that orchestra, but it was forever searching for more violas or more cellos, and orchestras have sprung up in quite a number now on the South Shore, so we were competing with other people for those players. But I miss the repertoire. I especially fond of Sibelius, and we did Sibelius. We did the First Symphony. We did the King Christian Second Suite, which was a lovely piece. And of course, Corellia. Things that fit the orchestra. You find music that fits the orchestra, because you can't always fit the orchestra to the music you want to do.
Now, you also did work regionally, nationally, as a clinician in some of the professional organizations you worked with. Tell me a little bit about that.
Those were music festivals. I conducted all states. Each state would have an all-state festival. Some of the states would have Massachusetts, for example, has a Northeastern festival or a Southeastern festival or a middle or a Western festival. Mm-hmm. And I would be invited to conduct at those festivals. I did the New Hampshire Festival, all-state, twice.
Were these mostly band, or were they also orchestra?
Mostly band, mm-hmm. But I did orchestras too. I did Maine more than once in Maine, Vermont twice. Those were band. I did Connecticut, and also Rhode Island, also New York State, and out west I did New Mexico. I did a festival in Texas. Thinking back on those things. you work very hard for a day and a half or 2 days, and then suddenly you're saying goodbye to the youngsters. I remember I did a Pennsylvania festival and worked so hard. Wow, I was exhausted when I got through. And I was a young man in those days. It's a chance to influence a lot of people. I conducted at the Midwestern Music and Art Camp. That was for a whole week, in which I conducted 2 bands and the symphony orchestra. The band, we did the Hindemus Symphony. We did Giannini. With the symphony, I did Pahola's Daughter of Sibelius, that wonderful tone poem, and the Beethoven number 8.
Wow.
This is high school students, but I had rehearsal every day for a whole week of each group. So there's a lot of conducting.
Now with these, at some of these festivals, how much original, band music were you doing?
It's all original band.
So you had already gotten interested in that already.
Yeah. And at Kansas, at the Midwest Music and Art Festival, which was at the University of Kansas, the head of that group, who was band director at the University of Kansas, was playing a lot of transcriptions all the time, and his guest conductors would always come in and do transcriptions, which would be Tchaikovsky tone poems and arranged for band. And he did Till Eulenspiegel arranged for band. The kids could play.
Wow.
The players were good, and I came in with with Hindemus Symphony and Giannini. Forgotten who else now, which required a lot of playing too. But I remember my host was standing behind me as I was signing autographs at the end of the last concert. And he was there for the whole summer, the student for whom I was signing the autograph. He said, "Well, next week it's back to transcriptions." And I didn't feel small, but I was sorry he said it, because my host stand looking over my shoulder.
So how are some of your ideas about original music? What did your fellow band conductors feel about that? Was that a new idea, or?
It was new in that I was playing only original pieces, and I added up in anticipating a meeting with you. I added up the number of composers who've written for MIT. 65 composers have written for MIT. 13 of them are MIT composers. And of the 65 composers, that represents 145 different compositions. For example, Bavicki's name appears here. I counted him as one composer, but he's on here for, I think, about 13 pieces of Bavicki's that I've done. And some of the other composers, like Eddie Madden, I've done, he's on for six pieces, but only one was written specifically for us. But we've done other pieces, same composers. Some of these composers are one composer's from Japan, 2 are from England, 2 from France, and 1 from Spain, wonderful piece from Spain. I shall miss that repertoire.
Wow. I'd like to put a copy of that list sometime.
Can I give you this one?
Or we could make a photocopy after the session.
Yeah, all right.
Who were some of the band conductors that you admire over the years?
Well, the man who influenced me a great deal, although I was fortunate enough not to be a student of his, was William D. Ravelli, University of Michigan. You know that name.
Yes.
And he conducted the New England Music Festival band in 1952, I'm going to say, about them. And I listened to his every word. I was at every one of the rehearsals, taking notes and listening to him. He really turned me on. But he was rough on the kids. He was rough on the music educators of the area, and made a lot of enemies. Enough so that when I wanted him as a guest conductor for a New England event, some years later, the memories held, and they wouldn't take Ravelli. But Ravelli and I became friends, enough so we'd look each other up whenever we were near each other. And I saw him most recently when he was at Concord, conducting the Concord band. This would have been about 4 or 5 years ago. Ravelli turned me on very much. When we hosted at MIT, the New England Intercollegiate Band, I had Thor Johnson, who was at the time the conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony. And then in 1985, I had Eugene Corporon, who has moved around. I think he's now in Texas, but he was very good. But Ravelli was really the master of all the band conductors.
What were some of the things about him that you liked?
The tone that he got from the band. He'd stop on a certain chord and play that chord until it was beautiful. Then he'd play the whole piece very slowly, so it would still have that same beauty, that chord, even if it were a march, a chord and a march or something. And I think that's a technique that I adopted quite a way, was to, if you found something that didn't sound right, play that note, spell that chord, only the woodwinds, only the brass, upper brass and upper woodwinds, to find out where the ingredient was that wasn't right, the fungus among us. To find where it needed to be fit. And then if it was a note that was flat, why is it flat? Because was his instrument not in? It was worth it to take time to tune the chord, to tune the first note of a piece, and move on.
Did he do transcriptions, or was he also interested in the original repertoire?
I would say mixed. He put out some albums, the Ravelli years, which I recall mostly original works, like Percy Granger, that sort of stuff. I don't think of him so much on contemporary music. Fred Fennell at Eastman was more into some of the more recent compositions. As the old master, there isn't much to choose from the old masters. There's only one Respighi piece, and it's just barely 5 minutes. Fennell said to me that he thought Respighi could have done better by us, meaning us band directors.
So your ideas about original repertoire and just contemporary music, that seems really interdirected with you, and it wasn't. It seems like it was your ideas and your inspiration.
Well,
it's remarkable.
I think Kusavinsky had something to do with it.
Uh-huh.
You know, I was going to symphony when Kusi was presenting new pieces. I remember the Roy Harris No. 3, wonderful piece.
Did you ever play under him?
No,
No.
not even off stage,
Uh-huh.
but I played under Leinsdorf, and also Steinberg.
Wow. Well, it's just at this point I was going to start asking about MIT. We've been going for about an hour and 10 minutes. Do you want to talk a little bit about, we can talk about some of the early stuff at years at MIT, and then maybe in a subsequent interview we can get into more detail.
Sure.
So tell me about the circumstances that brought you to MIT.
In 1948, I had received a message to call Professor Liebman at MIT, and I did, and he wanted me to come over for an interview about being band director, and I put it off and put it off. I had no desire to go to MIT because it wasn't known for its music.
That's
or
right.
anything. It had its banjo club,
Yeah.
and I saw that. And although I knew I was friends with Bob Cady, who was a flute player and had played in an orchestra at MIT, but I put it off and put it off and put it off. And finally I went, and it must have been 3 weeks after that initial phone call. I went and met with Klaus Liebman and Jim Burkhardt, a student, up in the top floor of Walker Memorial Building, on this end of the building, on the west end, in the corner room. And he explained that they had more wind and brass percussion players this year at MIT than could be accommodated by the orchestra, which ideally needs 1 or 3 trumpets maybe, or 3 or 4 trumpets, 3 or 4 trombones at the most, maybe 1 or 2 percussionists, you know, and wind players also, woodwinds. And that a number of the students had gathered together under Jim Burkhardt, who was sitting there, and had met and decided they really needed some professional guidance, some professional conductor. And I asked Jim what the instrumentation was, and he told me, and it was quite complete instrumentation: flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons even, horns, trumpets, trombones. I'm not sure what the baritone situation was, tubas, percussionists. And this was a Wednesday, and they're rehearsing tonight. Well, I ended up staying there for that rehearsal and stayed ever since. Because not only was it an exciting group, they were so bright, they were quick. They were some of the most intelligent musicians I've ever conducted, of course. And the enthusiasm was just contagious. So it became the high point of my week. It was once a week, I think, in those days. So that was the way it started.
Did Klaus Liebman have a hand in making sure that you were hired? How was he involved in that?
I just said, I'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
The word.
Yeah.
So Klaus
Yeah.
hired.
Yeah. Now, I also read that you had the title of Assistant Director of Music for a while. Was that assistant to Klaus?
Yeah, but it didn't mean anything. It was only in name, only Klaus. Klaus and I got along very well at times, at other times we didn't. I have to say that Klaus would get in over his head financially on some of his projects, and he'd take money from other accounts, including the band account, and I was trying to procure instruments to outfit this band that was coming, because a lot of the students didn't have their own instruments, like tubas,
Right.
that sort of thing. So I was buying used tubas and baritones, that sort of thing. So every now and then there would be a blow-up between Klaus and myself. I admired his musicianship, and we had a lot of good times together, but also I had reason to question his validity, or how am I trying a nice way to say that. I didn't always trust him on the financial matters, because I would hate to go ahead and line up some instruments to purchase and then find the money was no longer there in the account that presumably I had.
What was he like as a violinist?
Good. He played in the pops.
Mm-hmm.
He played in the pops, he was a good violinist.
Did you ever conduct while he was playing a violin concerto or anything? Did you do any collaborations like that?
The only collaboration I played for him when he was conducting.
Oh, really? What did you play?
A trumpet.
Yeah, but what was the piece? Do you remember?
Whether it was Messiah or one of the cantatas or something that he would be doing at Kresge. And on the commissioned work from Copeland, Canticle of Freedom,
Yes.
I didn't play trumpet, I played triangle. I'm on the first performance of that. Klaus was hard to follow. He was all over the place, technique-wise, but nevertheless the music sounded. He'd asked me to cover his rehearsals for him frequently. I forgot what caused me to be named assistant director of music, because it didn't mean anything. It didn't change salary, it didn't change what I was doing. In those days I was doing the band, the brass ensemble, and the woodwind groups, and then with Trappe and Vescuria, I had some assistants on some of that, you see. Klaus, the collaboration I had with Klaus musically was on the musical joke by Mozart.
Uh-huh.
You know of that piece?
Yes.
In which Klaus played violin, I played French horn, my wife played second French horn, and Mike somebody or other played string bass, and Klaus was Bridget and that sort of thing, and funny as could be. This was for Texapop, and there used to be a thing in the fall that we don't no longer have. It was a fun affair where various living groups put on a skit or something. What was that called? Forgotten now.
Later on, when there was more people on the music faculty here, did you do any collaborations with any others?
No. I was trying to think of Gregory Tuckham. No. He was a pianist and didn't play with us, although he wrote a wonderful piece for us. Forgotten who the organist was. I did combine with the organist. Can't remember his name now. When Kresge organ was built, he'd be at the organ, I'd be over in the choir loft on the other side. In fact, we tried to do a commencement like that. And the communication between Rockwell Cage and Kresge broke down, so we kept playing long after they wanted us to stop. And I think from then on, we were live music in Rockwell Cage. and later included in court.
Wow. Now, you were conductor of the MIT Symphony from 1956 to 64, is that correct?
Or 66.
66.
I think it was 66.
Okay. Tell me about some of the repertoire that you did and some of the ideas that you brought to that group.
Right away, I wanted to do some of the exciting 20th century pieces. And the first program, maybe it was the first program, I'm not sure, was the Roy Harris Third Symphony.
Wow.
Which was a wonderful experience. Turned the orchestra on. We early on, I invited students who had done solo work, concertos, to play with the orchestra. And Jared Litton, pianist, who also played violin, played 4 piano concertos. And also we had some violinists. Janet Stober, who was concert mistress, played the Beethoven concerto. Al Ray played the Sibelius concerto. This is with the student orchestra, you see. We Litton did forgotten what the first concerto, I think he maybe did the Rie concerto. The Gershwin concerto, I know.
There was like the Gershwin concerto in F?
Yeah. It's been 30 years since I've thought about these things.
What were some of the other 20th century pieces that you did with them? And did you find resistance among the students?
No resistance.
Wow.
We did the Firebird Suite.
Mm-hmm.
We did a manuscript by a student, a Greek student, Honzeus, who had lived in Greece in his homeland at the time of Nazi strafing and that sort of thing. And there were air raids in the piece, and it was a full-length symphony.
Wow.
And a terrifying piece. Yet we counterbalanced things like that at other concerts with Haydn Cello Concerto with Carlos Preto. Some names are coming back now. I told you earlier about the ballet we did.
Mm-hmm.
We did the Prelude to Rumpelstiltskin by Andrew Kasdan.
What was that piece like?
Well, Kasdan went to conservatory
Yeah.
and then came back to MIT, wrote a piece, the Rumpelstiltskin, for small orchestra and narrator, and it was a very attractive piece. And it was done, I got it done at the Brookline Youth Concert, which was Harry Ellis Dixon, an orchestra of about 24 people. And Andy did the prelude for full symphony, opened up the prelude, and we did that for the whole symphony at MIT. I did the complete Rumpelstiltskin for chamber orchestra down at Hingham, and Andy came for that performance. Very attractive piece.
When Andrew Kasdan became a record producer, did he continue composing after that? Do you know? And is he doing anything like that?
No, the only writing he did was a thing on one of his first records that he did with the combined brass ensembles of Philadelphia, Boston, and Cleveland. It was the 12 Days of Christmas. He wrote that arrangement. That's the only thing he wrote.
He's a very talented composer,
Yeah.
and I'm just wondering if he had continued doing anything.
I've been slowly reading a book by Pierre Boulez. Well, it's an interview of Boulez. And I just yesterday came across a paragraph in which he talks about Kasdan as being probably the best that he works with as a recording engineer, producer.
Wow. So with the MIT Symphony, you're doing some new music, but it sounded like the orchestra was pretty supportive of that. That's not always common with college orchestras.
Well, I never sensed any reluctance to play those pieces. In those days, we used to combine with other orchestras at girls' schools. That had been the tradition to take the orchestra to Smith College, and also Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke. I did the Midsummer Nights incidental music at Mount Holyoke with chorus.
Wow.
And I can remember to this day the expression on the girl's face when they sing "You Spotted Snakes." And we played, trying to think what modern pieces we'd done. We did the Shostakovich Fifth with Smith. We combined with Wellesley. Isabel Pralasta played bassoon. Isabel Kroa was her maiden name. She was a student at Wellesley, still at Wellesley. No, I felt a thirst for American music, modern music.
Wow, that's great. What other ensembles did you conduct at MIT? There was a brass ensemble you had?
Well, I had a brass ensemble which meeting once a week at MIT. And we'd play around at clubs, at men's clubs. It wasn't as busy as it is now. And there would be some overlap between the brass ensemble and the concert band. And if we had a right combination of instruments, I'd do a Mozart divertimento or something with woodwind. In other words, I had a lot of chamber music I wanted to use.
Were you ever involved in any of the jazz ensembles like the Tectonians and things like that?
Didn't need to be, because somebody was doing the Tectonians. I've forgotten who it was now. I remember Herb Pomeroy, but before that, I've forgotten who it was.
Yeah. Wow. This is the end of the first interview with John Corley.